What if the most beautiful city in Japan was also its most carefully controlled prison? The first thing visitors noticed was not the women. It was the silence. Not the silence of an empty place, but the carefully arranged silence of a city where every smile had a price, every doorway had a rule, and every person understood that invisible walls could be stronger than stone. Behind a single guarded entrance stood a district unlike any other on Earth. Thousands of lanterns glowed after sunset. Music drifted through narrow streets. The fragrance of incense mixed with cherry blossoms in spring and fresh rain during summer evenings. To wealthy merchants, ambitious samurai, celebrated poets, and curious travelers, it appeared to be a paradise built entirely for pleasure. But to many who lived inside its gates, it was something entirely different. It was a world where freedom could disappear behind elegant silk robes. Its name was Yoshiwara. For more than 2 centuries, this remarkable district stood at the center of Japanese urban life, surviving political change, devastating fires, economic collapse, and cultural revolution. It inspired masterpieces of art, influenced fashion across the country, and shaped literature that is still studied today. Yet beneath the beauty existed another story, one rarely told in full. It was the story of ordinary people trapped inside an extraordinary system. To understand Yoshiwara, we must first travel back to 17th century Japan. The year was 1603, after generations of brutal civil war. Japan finally entered an age of peace under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. The new military government established its headquarters in Edo, the city that would later become modern Tokyo. Peace transformed everything. Castles no longer prepared for endless battles. Roads once used by marching armies filled with merchants carrying rice, silk, paper, ceramics, and tea. Cities expanded at astonishing speed. Farmers migrated toward growing urban centers. Artisans opened workshops. Booksellers lined busy streets. Entertainment became an industry. Within only a few decades, Edo became one of the largest cities in the world. Population growth created opportunity. It also created problems. Where thousands of young, unmarried men gathered to work, unofficial entertainment districts appeared almost overnight. Small brothels operated in hidden neighborhoods. Illegal gambling flourished. Street performers attracted enormous crowds. Crime became increasingly difficult to control. The Tokugawa government believed order was the foundation of peace. Rather than attempting to eliminate prostitution completely, a goal considered unrealistic, they chose another strategy: control it. In 1617, authorities officially licensed a single district where prostitution could legally operate under strict government supervision. That district became known as Yoshiwara. The decision reflected the practical mindset of Tokugawa officials. If entertainment could not disappear, it could at least be regulated. Every entrance could be monitored. Every business could be taxed. Every visitor could be watched. The district itself functioned almost like a separate city. Tall walls surrounded much of its perimeter. A controlled entrance limited movement. Watchmen observed those entering and leaving. Curfews existed. Business licenses required official approval. Nothing inside operated entirely beyond government observation. Ironically, the place famous for pleasure was also among the most heavily regulated neighborhoods in Japan. Its location changed after a catastrophic disaster. In 1657, the Great Fire of Meriki swept through Edo with terrifying force. Driven by strong winds, flames consumed enormous sections of the city. Hundreds of thousands lost homes. Many thousands died. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath smoke and ash. The original Yoshiwara could not escape destruction. After the disaster, officials relocated the district farther from the growing city center. The new location became known as Shin Yoshiwara, New Yoshiwara. Although rebuilt, its essential structure remained unchanged. Visitors entered through a single prominent gateway. Wide central streets stretched ahead. Rows of carefully designed buildings displayed remarkable craftsmanship. Lanterns illuminated wooden facades. Seasonal flowers decorated entrances. The district projected refinement rather than chaos. This appearance mattered enormously. Owners competed not only through beauty but through prestige. The finest establishments resembled luxurious mansions more than ordinary businesses. Inside, expensive folding screens displayed elegant paintings. Tatami floors remained spotless. Tea was served in exquisite ceramics. Music floated softly through reception rooms. Guests encountered an atmosphere designed to suggest sophistication instead of vice. For wealthy visitors, entering Yoshiwara often felt like stepping into another world. Reality, however, depended entirely upon which side of the reception room one occupied. The customer saw possibility. The worker saw obligation. Most women did not arrive because they freely pursued adventure. Many entered through poverty. Throughout Tokugawa Japan, economic hardship affected countless farming families. Poor harvests, heavy taxes, natural disasters, and debt could push entire households toward impossible choices. Some parents signed long-term labor contracts for daughters. Others borrowed money they could never repay. Middlemen traveled through rural villages promising employment in the city. Sometimes those promises contained fragments of truth. Often they concealed painful realities. Once contracts were signed, escape became extraordinarily difficult. Debt followed the individual. Transportation required permission. Identity records remained closely monitored. For many young women, Yoshiwara became not a destination but a sentence measured in years. Not every life inside followed the same path. The district possessed a strict hierarchy. At the top stood the legendary Warren. Outside Japan, the word is sometimes misunderstood, and Warren was far more than a sex worker. She represented years of education, discipline, and artistic training. Only a tiny fraction of women achieved this status. An apprentice spent years learning formal etiquette. She mastered classical poetry. She practiced elegant handwriting. She studied conversation. She memorized seasonal customs. She learned flower arrangement, tea ceremony, music, dance, fashion. The ideal Warren could discuss literature with scholars, politics with merchants, and aesthetics with artists. Her appearance itself became performance. Layers of magnificent silk kimono displayed breathtaking craftsmanship. Hair ornaments glittered beneath lantern light. Her wooden platform sandals towered high above the street. When she walked, attendants accompanied her in elaborate public processions. Crowds gathered simply to watch. These spectacular walks became famous throughout Edo. Artists hurried to sketch them. Visitors described them in diaries. Children dreamed of witnessing them. Yet the beauty concealed exhausting discipline. Every movement required perfection. Every smile demanded control. Every mistake carried consequences. Even the most celebrated Warren remained bound by contracts few could simply abandon. Freedom remained elusive, regardless of fame. Far below these celebrated figures worked countless others whose names history barely recorded. They cleaned rooms before sunrise, prepared clothing, served meals, maintained buildings, welcomed guests, supported the dazzling illusion surrounding the district. Without them, Yoshiwara could never have functioned. History often remembers extraordinary individuals. Entire systems survive because ordinary people disappear into the background. Among those forgotten workers was a 14-year-old girl arriving one rainy autumn evening. She had never seen a city larger than her farming village. She carried one small bundle containing spare clothing, family keepsakes, and a letter from her mother already softened by tears. The gate slowly opened. Lantern light spilled across the wet ground. She looked upward, expecting opportunity. She did not yet understand that every step beyond the entrance would change the rest of her life. And somewhere beyond the crowded streets, hidden behind silk curtains and polished wooden doors, another young apprentice was preparing for an examination that would determine whether she might someday become one of Yoshiwara's celebrated Warren, or disappear forever into the anonymous machinery of the district. Neither girl knew that history itself was quietly waiting for them. Rain continued to fall long after the gate closed behind the girl. The sound echoed softly across the wooden walkways as servants hurried beneath paper umbrellas, carrying baskets of fresh vegetables, folded silk garments, bundles of firewood, and small lanterns whose warm light shimmered against the wet streets. The girl tightened her grip on the cloth bundle she carried. It was all she owned. Her name was Eiko. History has forgotten countless names like hers. The records that survived often preserved only contracts, debts, purchases, and transfers. Thousands of young women entered Yoshiwara over the centuries without leaving behind more than a few fading lines in official documents. Their dreams rarely appeared in government archives. Eiko had grown up nearly 200 miles north of Edo in a farming village where every season determined whether a family would eat through the winter. Her father had once owned enough land to support everyone. Then floods destroyed one harvest. Disease ruined another. Taxes remained unchanged despite empty fields. Moneylenders arrived before hope did. Debt became a permanent visitor. At first the family sold livestock, then tools, then pieces of farmland. Finally, there was nothing left except labor. Across Tokugawa, Japan, stories like theirs became painfully familiar. Peace had brought prosperity to many cities, but not every farming community shared equally in that wealth. Population increased. Land became scarce. Crop failures pushed already struggling families toward impossible decisions. Some sons became laborers. Others entered military service under local domains. Many daughters were sent away under contracts promising employment in urban centers. Sometimes they became domestic servants. Sometimes apprentices. Sometimes they disappeared into licensed districts like Yoshiwara. The paperwork always described the arrangement in careful legal language. Reality was rarely so gentle. Eiko remembered the final evening at home. Her mother had sewn a tiny cloth charm into the inside of her sleeve. "Never forget your name," she whispered. No promises were made about returning. No one could honestly make them. The journey to Edo lasted weeks. Travelers moved along the great highways built by the Tokugawa government. These roads connected castles, villages, ports, and growing cities across Japan. Merchants carried silk from Kyoto. Rice moved toward expanding markets. Pilgrims visited sacred shrines. Government officials traveled with large entourages. Artists sketched landscapes that later became famous woodblock prints. Foreign visitors were almost non-existent. Japan had entered an era historians now call sakoku, a policy often translated as closed country. International trade continued in limited forms through carefully controlled ports, but foreign influence remained tightly restricted. The government believed stability depended upon limiting outside political and religious interference. While Europe expanded across oceans through colonization and maritime empires, Tokugawa Japan turned inward, cultivating one of the world's most distinctive urban cultures. That culture flourished in Edo. Nothing had prepared Eiko for her first glimpse of the city. Endless rooftops stretched toward the horizon. Canals carried boats loaded with rice. Street vendors shouted above the crowds. Children raced through narrow alleys. Craftsmen hammered iron. Paper makers displayed colorful goods. Booksellers stacked freshly printed novels beside illustrated travel guides. Musicians played flutes outside tea houses. Everywhere she looked, people hurried with purpose. Edo was not simply large. It felt alive. Historians estimate that by the 18th century, its population exceeded 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. London and Paris were growing rapidly. Beijing remained enormous. Yet Edo stood comfortably among the greatest urban centers of its age. Its success depended upon extraordinary organization. Water systems supplied neighborhoods. Fire brigades responded to emergencies. Markets operated with remarkable efficiency. Road networks connected every district. Behind the apparent chaos existed careful planning. Yoshiwara formed only a tiny piece of this expanding metropolis. Yet its cultural influence reached far beyond its walls. Fashion trends often began there. Popular hairstyles spread from its streets. Poetry circulated through the city after being composed inside elegant tea houses. Woodblock artists produced thousands of prints depicting famous courtesans, seasonal festivals, and evening promenades. These images traveled across Japan. Centuries later, they would inspire artists in Europe, including painters fascinated by Japanese composition and color. Inside the district, however, admiration meant little to newcomers. Eiko followed an older attendant through narrow corridors lined with polished wood. The building smelled faintly of cedar, incense, and fresh tatami. Women moved quietly from room to room. Some wore magnificent silk robes. Others dressed simply while completing ordinary work. No one spoke loudly. Everyone appeared busy. The attendant stopped before a small room. "This is yours." The room contained almost nothing. A folded sleeping mat, a wooden shelf, a wash basin, one small paper window overlooking a courtyard. Eiko set down her bundle. For the first time since leaving home, she cried. Not loudly, only enough for the tears to disappear before anyone noticed. Elsewhere inside Yoshiwara, another young woman prepared for an entirely different future. Her name was Hana. Unlike Eiko, she had lived inside the district since childhood. Years earlier, she too had arrived frightened and uncertain. Now she walked with remarkable grace. Every movement reflected endless practice. Her instructors corrected even the smallest mistake. How she poured tea, how she bowed, how she unfolded a fan, how she pronounced classical poetry, how long she allowed silence to remain between sentences. Nothing escaped attention. Perfection was expected because reputation determined value. The finest houses competed fiercely for wealthy patrons. An accomplished apprentice represented years of expensive investment. Education inside elite establishments resembled finishing schools as much as commercial training. Reading, writing, music, history, calligraphy, dance, and conversation occupied every day. Failure wasted both money and prestige. Success elevated an entire establishment. Hana understood the rules. She also understood their cost. Looking through a paper window that evening, she watched new arrivals crossing the courtyard. Among them, she noticed Eiko. Their eyes met only for a moment. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. Yet both recognized something familiar. Fear. Outside the walls of Yoshiwara, Edo celebrated another peaceful night. Families gathered for dinner. Theaters prepared evening performances. Merchants counted profits. Samurai discussed politics over cups of warm sake. Most citizens never considered the invisible network of contracts, debts, and obligations that kept districts like Yoshiwara functioning. To many outsiders, it remained a place of elegance and entertainment. To those within its gates, every sunrise reminded them that beauty alone could never erase the weight of captivity. And before winter arrived, both Eiko and Hana would discover that surviving Yoshiwara required far more than courage. Winter arrived quietly over Edo. A thin layer of frost settled across rooftops before sunrise, turning the sprawling city into a landscape of silver. Smoke curled upward from thousands of chimneys as families prepared morning meals. Merchants unlocked their shops, and fishermen pushed their boats into the cold waters of the nearby rivers. Inside Yoshiwara, the day began long before dawn. Servants swept every wooden walkway until no trace of dust remained. Fresh tatami mats were inspected. Silk robes were carefully brushed and folded. Lanterns that had burned throughout the night were extinguished one by one. Every building had to appear flawless before the first visitor arrived. For Eiko, the morning started with work. She was not allowed near the elegant reception rooms. Instead, she carried water from the well, washed wooden floors, polished lacquer trays, folded bedding, and delivered meals to senior attendants. Every task had to be completed silently. Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes with sharp words, sometimes with long hours of additional labor. The rules were simple. Do not question. Do not complain. Do not stop moving. Days soon blended together. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. The rhythm of Yoshiwara never slowed. Outside the district, Edo continued to grow into one of the greatest cities on Earth. Inside, time seemed measured only by contracts and obligations. One afternoon, while carrying folded kimono to an upstairs room, Eiko accidentally paused near a practice hall. Music drifted through the paper walls. Curious, she looked inside. Young apprentices moved gracefully across polished floors, while an elderly instructor played the shamisen. Every step was deliberate, every gesture precise. A single mistake caused the music to stop. The instructor quietly demonstrated the movement again. No shouting, no anger, only perfection repeated until perfection became habit. Among the apprentices stood Hana. Her posture was flawless. Years of discipline showed in every movement. She noticed Eiko watching through the doorway. After practice ended, Hana stepped outside. "You are new," she said softly. Eiko nodded. "I've been here 3 months. It feels longer, doesn't it?" Eiko looked down. "I thought cities were places where people became free." Hana smiled sadly. "Some people do. And us." Hana remained silent for several seconds. "Freedom means different things here." Before Eiko could ask another question, an older attendant called Hana away. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet it became the first genuine kindness Eiko had experienced since entering Yoshiwara. Over the following weeks, brief conversations became more common. Sometimes they met while carrying supplies. Sometimes while preparing seasonal decorations. Sometimes only for a few moments beneath blooming plum trees inside a quiet courtyard. Hana never spoke loudly. She had learned that walls often listened. Instead, she shared knowledge. She explained which supervisors showed compassion, which corridors remained busiest, how to avoid unnecessary punishment, which older workers secretly helped frighten newcomers. In a place built upon hierarchy, small acts of kindness became acts of quiet resistance. Meanwhile, preparations filled the district. The New Year approached. Across Japan, New Year celebrations represented one of the most important holidays of the year. Homes were cleaned thoroughly. Old debts were settled whenever possible. Special meals were prepared. Families gathered to pray for health and prosperity. Even within Yoshiwara, traditions continued. Pine branches decorated entrances. Fresh flowers appeared in reception rooms. Musicians rehearsed festive performances. The district shimmered beneath hundreds of glowing lanterns. Visitors would soon arrive wearing their finest clothing. For a few nights, Yoshiwara would become brighter than ever. Yet beneath the celebration lay constant financial pressure. Every candle, every silk robe, every elaborate decoration, every meal, every lesson, everything had a cost, and those costs were carefully recorded. Account books survived long after many names disappeared. Historians studying Yoshiwara discovered detailed financial records documenting clothing expenses, food, medical care, entertainment, building repairs, taxes, and debts. For many workers, these expenses were deducted from future earnings. Freedom depended not only upon time, but upon money. And debt often grew faster than it could be repaid. One evening, Hana quietly showed Eiko an old ledger. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting. Rows of numbers covered nearly every sheet. "What is this?" Eiko whispered. "Our lives. I don't understand." "You will." Hana pointed toward one column. "Every robe." Another column. "Every lesson." Another. "Every meal." Another. "Even medicine." Eiko stared at the endless calculations. "When does it end?" Hana slowly closed the book. "For some people." She hesitated. "It never does." Outside, laughter echoed through the streets as wealthy visitors admired the dazzling beauty of Yoshiwara. They praised its elegance, its music, its graceful performances, its magnificent fashion. Few realized that behind every perfectly arranged evening stood hundreds of invisible workers whose lives were measured in careful columns of ink. As winter deepened, another danger quietly approached. Fire. Every resident of Edo feared it. The city was built primarily from wood. Homes stood close together. Paper screens divided rooms. Oil lamps burned every evening. A single spark carried by the winter wind could destroy entire neighborhoods. The people of Edo had a saying: "Fires and arguments are the flowers of Edo." It sounded almost humorous. In reality, everyone understood its meaning. Disaster was never far away. Within months, Yoshiwara itself would once again face the terrifying power that had already reshaped its history decades before. And when the flames came, they would force Eiko and Hana to make a decision neither of them had ever imagined. The first warning came before sunrise. A temple bell rang once. Then again. Then again. The slow rhythm carried across Edo's rooftops like a heartbeat that had suddenly begun to race. People stopped what they were doing. Merchants stepped into the streets. Boatmen looked toward the northern sky. Mothers pulled children indoors. No one needed an explanation. Smoke, a thin gray column, rose above the distant neighborhoods before expanding into a dark cloud that seemed to swallow the morning light. Within minutes, another bell answered from farther away. Then another. Across Edo, the city's firewatch system had awakened. Centuries before telephones or electric alarms, bells, lookout towers, and messenger runners formed one of the world's most sophisticated emergency warning networks. Every district understood the signals. Every resident knew that speed meant survival. Inside Yoshiwara, managers immediately began issuing orders. Cover the lanterns. Move the records. Prepare the water buckets. Wake everyone. The district transformed with astonishing efficiency. Servants formed long lines beside wells. Heavy wooden doors were secured. Valuable silk garment disappeared into storage chests. Account books were wrapped in oilcloth. Money boxes were carried toward reinforced rooms. Eiko had never witnessed such urgency. Only yesterday, the streets had echoed with music. Today they echoed with commands. She hurried alongside dozens of other workers carrying bucket after bucket, until her hands felt numb from the freezing water. Hana appeared beside her without speaking. Together they joined the endless human chain stretching across the courtyard. Everyone understood one terrible truth. If the wind changed direction, Yoshiwara could burn. Edo had earned another nickname over the centuries: The City of Fires. Historians estimate that major fires struck the capital dozens of times during the Tokugawa era. Wooden buildings, narrow streets, paper walls, open flames, and seasonal winds created perfect conditions for catastrophe. Entire neighborhoods sometimes vanished in a single afternoon. Yet every disaster forced the city to rebuild stronger than before. The people of Edo had become unwilling experts in survival. By noon, the smoke had grown thicker. Ash drifted through the air like dark snow. Visitors stopped arriving. Instead, frightened residents rushed through the streets carrying children, bedding, family documents, and anything they could save. Some pulled wooden carts. Others balanced belongings across their shoulders. Everyone kept glancing toward the sky. Inside the main reception hall, senior managers faced another difficult decision. If the fire reached Yoshiwara, should the gates remain locked? The question was not simple. For decades, the district had operated under strict regulations. Movement in and out was carefully controlled. Opening the gates without permission risked disorder. Keeping them closed risked trapping hundreds of people. History records that during several major fires, emergency decisions like these became matters of life and death. Rules written during peaceful times often collapsed when disaster arrived. Late that afternoon, a messenger galloped through the entrance covered in soot. The fire has crossed another district. Silence filled the room. The wind had changed. Outside, Eiko looked upward. For the first time, she could see orange light glowing beneath the smoke. Not close enough to feel. Close enough to fear. Around her, workers continued carrying water. Some prayed quietly. Others whispered the names of family members they had not seen in years. Hana stood perfectly still. "What are you thinking?" Eiko asked. Hana did not answer immediately. "When I first arrived here," she finally said, "I believed these walls were stronger than anything." She looked toward the distant smoke. But fire doesn't recognize walls. As evening approached, the air became strangely warm despite the winter season. Burning embers floated overhead. One landed gently in the courtyard before fading into ash. Another settled on a rooftop. Workers rushed forward to extinguish it immediately. The district waited. Every passing minute felt longer than the last. Then, just before sunset, another messenger arrived. Breathing heavily, he bowed before the managers. "The firefighters have stopped it." No one moved. No one celebrated. The words seemed almost impossible to believe. "The wind shifted again," he continued. The fire turned east. Relief spread slowly through the building. Some people laughed nervously. Others cried. Many simply sat where they stood, exhausted. Yoshiwara had escaped. This time. That night the district remained unusually quiet. Few lanterns were lit. Music was cancelled. Visitors stayed away. Even the wealthiest customers understood that tragedy elsewhere in the city demanded respect. From an upstairs window, Eiko watched countless tiny fires still burning on the horizon. Entire neighborhoods had not been as fortunate. Hundreds of families would wake tomorrow with nothing left. Hana joined her at the window. "They'll rebuild," she said softly. "How do you know?" "Because Edo always rebuilds." She paused before adding, "But rebuilding a city is easier than rebuilding a life." Eiko thought about those words long after midnight. She realized something she had never understood before. The greatest danger inside Yoshiwara was not only the contracts, or the debts, or even the walls. It was how easily a person could begin believing that life could never be different. And beyond the district, a young publisher named Tsudya Juzaburo, whose books would one day change Japanese popular culture, was preparing to introduce a new generation of artists whose prints would make the faces of Yoshiwara's most famous courtesans known throughout the country. Neither Eiko nor Hana had ever heard his name. Soon, their world would become part of an artistic revolution that would preserve its beauty for centuries, while hiding much of its pain. Spring arrived almost overnight. The smoke of winter disappeared beneath clouds of pale pink blossoms. Across Edo, cherry trees burst into bloom, transforming riverbanks, temple grounds, and public gardens into seas of delicate color. Families gathered beneath the branches, poets filled notebooks with new verses, and painters hurried to capture scenes that would vanish within days. In Japan, the cherry blossom had long symbolized one unforgettable truth. Beauty never lasted forever. Inside Yoshiwara, that lesson was impossible to ignore. The district entered its busiest season of the year. Fresh lanterns lined the streets. Elegant banners fluttered above tea houses. Musicians rehearsed from morning until evening. Merchants delivered the finest silk from Kyoto, rare incense, expensive cosmetics, carved hair ornaments, and carefully painted folding fans. Everything had to be perfect. The spring festivals attracted wealthy merchants from Osaka, influential samurai, celebrated actors, scholars, and travelers eager to witness the famous beauty of Yoshiwara with their own eyes. Many had dreamed of visiting for years. Few realized how carefully every moment of their experience had been planned. Even the fragrance drifting through the streets was deliberate. Workers burned selected incense at different hours so that visitors associated each season with a distinct memory. Every lantern was positioned to flatter faces. Every room was arranged to create the illusion of effortless elegance. Nothing inside Yoshiwara happened by accident. Eiko noticed these details because she was learning to see what guests never questioned. She carried flowers to reception rooms before sunrise. She replaced candles before they burned low. She memorized which guests preferred tea before wine and which expected complete silence before beginning conversation. The work demanded constant attention. The reward was survival. One afternoon, Hana invited Eiko to watch something few newcomers ever witnessed. "Stay behind the screen," she whispered. "Don't make a sound." Eiko nodded. Moments later, the hallway outside filled with movement. Attendants appeared first, carrying embroidered parasols. Then musicians. Then 2 senior assistants. Finally she appeared. Enwarin. The room fell silent. She moved slowly through the corridor with extraordinary grace, her towering wooden sandals producing a steady rhythm against the polished floor. Her kimono shimmered with layers of embroidered silk. Gold-threaded cranes stretched across one sleeve. Flowing rivers decorated another. Her hair rose into an elaborate sculpture held together by dozens of gleaming ornaments that caught the afternoon light. Every step looked effortless. Every turn appeared rehearsed. She seemed almost unreal. Eiko forgot to breathe. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Hana watched quietly. "She is. She looks like a queen." Hana's eyes remained fixed upon the departing procession. Queens usually leave their palaces. The words lingered in Eiko's mind long after the procession disappeared. Later that evening, Hana explained what most visitors never understood. People think they see freedom because they see luxury. She carefully folded a silk robe before continuing. They never ask what it costs. The highest-ranking courtesans represented years of training and immense financial investment. They wore magnificent clothing. They entertained the wealthiest clients. Artists painted their portraits. Poets praised their elegance. Fashion across Japan often copied their hairstyles and clothing. Yet nearly every hour of their lives remained scheduled by others. Appointments, appearances, lessons, ceremonies, public processions, private meetings. Even rest followed strict rules. Their fame belonged to the district as much as to themselves. Outside Yoshiwara, another revolution quietly gathered strength. Printing presses across Edo worked day and night. Advances in woodblock printing made books and illustrated prints far more affordable than ever before. Ordinary merchants could now purchase beautifully printed novels, travel guides, actor portraits, and images of famous courtesans. Art was no longer reserved for the aristocracy. It entered everyday life. Among the publishers transforming this new industry was Tsuchiya Juzaburo. Unlike many businessmen of his time, Tsuchiya recognized talent wherever he found it. He encouraged bold artists. He supported daring writers. He understood that ordinary people hungered for stories reflecting the rapidly changing world around them. Yoshiwara became one of his greatest sources of inspiration. Illustrated books depicting its fashions, customs, and celebrated women spread throughout Japan. To readers hundreds of miles away, the district appeared magical. Elegant, sophisticated, almost mythical. The printed pages rarely showed exhausted workers washing floors before dawn. They did not depict frightened girls arriving through guarded gates. Beauty sold. Reality did not. One afternoon, a young artist arrived at the establishment where Hana worked. He carried sketchbooks rather than expensive gifts. Instead of staring at luxurious decorations, he quietly observed people. How attendants bowed. How musicians held their instruments. How sunlight entered a room. How expressions changed when visitors looked away. Hana noticed his unusual attention. "You aren't drawing the decorations," she said. The artist smiled. "They've already been painted many times." "What are you drawing?" "The moments nobody remembers." Hana studied the unfinished sketch. It showed an elderly servant carefully adjusting a lantern before sunset. Nothing glamorous. Nothing dramatic. Simply honest. "Will anyone buy that?" she asked. "I don't know." He closed the sketchbook. But history isn't made only by famous faces. As he walked away, Hana found herself thinking about those words. For years, she had believed that people like Eiko and herself would disappear without leaving even a whisper behind. Perhaps somewhere, in someone's notebook, a different story might survive. That evening, beneath blooming cherry blossoms, Eiko and Hana sat quietly in the courtyard after finishing their work. Petals drifted gently through the air. "They're beautiful," Eiko said. "They'll be gone next week," Hana replied. "Does that make them sad?" Hana smiled. "No. What does it make them?" She watched another blossom float toward the ground. Unforgettable. Neither of them realized that beyond the walls of Yoshiwara, political tensions and economic pressures were slowly beginning to reshape the peaceful world they had always known. The Tokugawa era still appeared stable. The streets were busy. Trade flourished. Art thrived. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. And within a single generation, those cracks would shake not only Yoshiwara, but all of Japan. The years passed so quietly that Eiko almost failed to notice them. At first, she counted every sunrise. Then every season. Eventually, she measured time by the blooming of cherry trees, the arrival of summer festivals, the crimson leaves of autumn, and the first snowfall covering Edo each winter. Life inside Yoshiwara followed its own calendar. Outside the walls, governments changed policies, merchants expanded fortunes, and villages struggled through floods and famine. Inside, the lanterns continued to glow. The music continued to play. The gates continued to open at sunset and close before dawn. To visitors, nothing seemed different. But beneath the polished surface, Japan itself was beginning to change. By the early 19th century, Edo had become even larger than before. Its crowded streets overflowed with bookstores, theaters, restaurants, bathhouses, craftsmen, and merchants. A new middle class had emerged. Unlike the samurai, these merchants possessed little political power. But they possessed something equally important: money. They became the driving force behind Japan's urban culture. They purchased paintings, collected books, commissioned poetry, sponsored theater. Fashion changed more rapidly than ever before. Yoshiwara stood at the center of this cultural explosion. If a famous courtesan wore a new hairstyle, women across Edo copied it within weeks. If an Waran selected a particular silk pattern, merchants rushed to produce affordable versions for ordinary customers. The district had become more than an entertainment quarter. It had become Japan's most influential trendsetter. Yet influence did not erase suffering. One rainy evening, Eiko discovered an elderly woman sitting alone behind one of the storage buildings. Her hands trembled as she carefully repaired an old kimono. Eiko recognized her immediately. Her name was Chiyo. She had worked inside Yoshiwara longer than almost anyone could remember. Once, decades earlier, she too had been celebrated for her beauty. Now few visitors even noticed her. Eiko quietly sat beside her. "May I help?" Chiyo smiled gently. "My eyes are growing old." Together they continued sewing in silence. Finally Chiyo spoke. "When I was your age, I believed beauty lasted forever." She laughed softly. "Then I believed sadness lasted forever." She tied another careful stitch. "I was wrong about both." Eiko listened carefully. "What lasts?" Chiyo looked toward the evening sky. "The stories." Those words stayed with Eiko. For days, she found herself watching everyone differently. The cooks laughing together before sunrise. The musicians practicing the same melodies year after year. The gardeners trimming tiny pine trees with endless patience. The young apprentices arriving through the gates with frightened eyes, exactly as she once had. Every person carried a story. Yet history rarely remembered ordinary lives. It remembered rulers, wars, generals, great artists, almost never the people who quietly carried the weight of everyday existence. Meanwhile, beyond Japan's shores, the world was changing at breathtaking speed. The Industrial Revolution transformed Europe. Steam engines replaced human labor. Railroads crossed entire nations. Factories multiplied. Global trade expanded rapidly. Western ships grew larger, faster, more powerful. Although Japan remained politically isolated under Tokugawa rule, complete isolation had become increasingly impossible. Foreign vessels occasionally appeared along distant coastlines. Government officials watched them carefully. Rumors spread through ports before reaching Edo. Some dismissed them. Others worried. Few understood how dramatically those distant events would soon affect their country. One evening, Hana climbed onto the roof of one of the taller buildings inside Yoshiwara. From there, she could see much of Edo stretching toward the horizon. Thousands of lanterns flickered beneath the night sky. Eiko joined her. "I've never seen the city like this," she whispered. Hana nodded. "It looks endless. Have you ever wanted to leave?" The question lingered between them. For several moments, only the wind answered. Every day, Hana finally admitted. Then why don't you stop hopping? Hana smiled. Because hope is the only thing they can't record in a ledger. Eiko looked toward the distant city. So many people. So many lives. Do you think anyone out there knows we're here? Hana thought carefully. They know Yoshiwara exists. But do they know us? No. The answer carried no bitterness. Only truth. The following spring brought an unusual visitor. He was neither merchant nor samurai, nor poet, nor actor. Instead, he carried notebooks filled with statistics, government records, maps. He spent hours walking through different districts of Edo, carefully observing population growth, commerce, housing, and public health. Officials increasingly recognized that cities required planning as they expanded. Even entertainment districts attracted administrative attention. The visitor rarely spoke. He simply observed. Eiko noticed him examining drainage systems, street widths, wells, and public buildings. He doesn't look like a customer, she whispered. Hana smiled. He's studying the city. For what? The future. That single word echoed strangely. The future. Inside Yoshiwara, tomorrow often looked identical to yesterday. Outside, history was accelerating. No one inside the district yet knew that within a few decades, black-hulled steamships from across the Pacific would arrive carrying demands that Japan could no longer ignore. The walls protecting the country would begin to crack. The old government would weaken. Ancient traditions would face unprecedented challenges. And when those changes reached Yoshiwara, they would force everyone inside its gates to confront a question far greater than survival. What happens when an entire world built over 2 centuries suddenly begins to disappear? The summer of 1853 began like countless others. Humidity settled over Edo before sunrise. Street vendors wiped sweat from their brows before opening their stalls. Children splashed in narrow canals. Merchants unfolded brightly colored awning to shield customers from the relentless sun. Inside Yoshiwara, preparations for another busy evening continued with practiced precision. Fresh flowers decorated reception rooms. Musicians tuned their instruments. Tea houses polished every wooden surface until it reflected the morning light. Nothing seemed unusual. Until the rumors arrived. At first they sounded impossible. Giant ships have entered the bay. They move without sails. They breathe smoke. The sea itself has caught fire. The stories spread from travelers, fishermen, government messengers, and merchants returning from the coast. Each version grew more extraordinary than the last. Most people dismissed them. Japan had heard strange rumors before. But these refused to disappear. Within days, the truth reached Edo. 4 enormous American warships had anchored near the entrance to Edo Bay. Their black-painted hulls and steam-powered engines shocked those who saw them. Many Japanese called them the Black Ships. They belonged to the expedition led by. For more than 2 centuries, the Tokugawa government had carefully controlled foreign contact. Now a powerful foreign navy had arrived carrying a letter from the President of the United States, demanding that Japan open relations. The visitors did not ask politely. Their military strength made the request impossible to ignore. Panic spread faster than official announcements. Markets filled with anxious shoppers. Some families stored extra rice. Others prepared to leave the city. Samurai hurried between government offices, carrying sealed documents. No one knew whether war would follow. Inside Yoshiwara, business slowed. Guests who normally discussed poetry and theater now spoke only of politics. Would the government resist? Would foreign soldiers land? Would Edo be attacked? For the first time in years, fear replaced entertainment as the city's favorite conversation. One evening, Eiko carried tea into a private room occupied by two wealthy merchants. Normally, they argued over silk prices or shipping routes. Tonight, they leaned over a map of Japan. If the Americans return with more ships, one whispered. They will. How can you be certain? Because nations powerful enough to cross the Pacific don't travel that far simply to go home empty-handed. Eiko quietly left the room. She understood little about international politics. But she understood fear. It sounded the same in every language. Later that night, she found Hana standing beneath the entrance gate. The older woman stared toward the distant south, where the bay lay beyond the city. Have you ever seen the ocean? Hana asked. Only once when I was very small. They say the ships are taller than temples. Do you believe that? Hana smiled faintly. I don't know anymore. She had spent nearly her entire life inside Yoshiwara. The outside world had always seemed distant. Now it was coming closer. Much closer. Months passed. Negotiations continued. Government officials debated endlessly. Some argued that Japan must resist foreign pressure at any cost. Others believed the country lacked the military strength to fight modern Western navies. Neither choice seemed safe. Finally, in 1854, the Tokugawa government signed an agreement opening limited relations with the United States. The decision ended more than 2 centuries of near isolation. It also marked the beginning of one of the greatest transformations in Japanese history. The changes did not happen overnight, but they began everywhere. Foreign books appeared. New technologies attracted attention. Translators became increasingly valuable. Western scientific knowledge spread cautiously through scholars and government officials. Merchants sensed opportunity. Young students dreamed of learning about the outside world. Even inside Yoshiwara, whispers of distant countries became common. Guests spoke about steam engines, railroads, photography, telegraphs, machines capable of producing goods faster than entire workshops. The world beyond Japan no longer seemed like legend. It had become reality. One afternoon, a traveler from the port city of Yokohama visited the district. Unlike most customers, he spent more time talking than drinking. I've seen them, he told several curious attendants. The foreigners. What are they like? Eiko asked quietly. They look different. Different how? They're taller. They speak loudly. They carry strange instruments. He paused before adding, and they watch everything with the same curiosity that we watch them. His answer surprised everyone. Until then, many inside Yoshiwara had imagined foreigners only as mysterious visitors. Now they realized something unexpected. To those foreigners, Japan itself was equally mysterious. That evening, Hana unfolded an old woodblock print showing the famous procession of Enwaran through Yoshiwara. She studied it carefully. Beautiful, Eiko said. Yes. Do you think people will still remember this place 100 years from now? Hana traced one of the printed figures with her finger. They'll remember the pictures. And us. Hana looked toward the quiet street outside. History was changing faster than either of them had ever imagined. The walls that had once seemed permanent were no longer unshakable. The country itself was beginning to redefine its future. I think, Hana said softly, the world we're living in is already becoming history. Neither woman could know that within less than 2 decades, the Tokugawa shogunate would collapse, the emperor would regain political power, and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration would transform every corner of Japan, including Yoshiwara itself. The district had survived fires, famine, earthquakes, economic crises. Now it faced something entirely different: modernity. And modernity would prove to be the greatest challenge it had ever known. The year was 1868. For generations, people across Japan had believed that the Tokugawa shogunate would last forever. It had governed the nation for more than 250 years. Its laws shaped everyday life. Its officials controlled the roads, the cities, the economy, and even the movement of ordinary people. To most Japanese, it was simply the natural order of the world. Then, almost overnight, that world disappeared. Following years of political conflict and growing pressure from foreign powers, the authority of the shogunate collapsed. Power was formally restored to the emperor in what historians now call the Meiji Restoration. The new government promised something Japan had never attempted before: modernization. Factories, railways, universal education, modern banking, a national army, industrial growth, new legal systems, Western science, international diplomacy. The pace of change stunned the country. Entire professions vanished. Others appeared almost overnight. The old Japan did not disappear completely, but it would never again be exactly the same. Even inside Yoshiwara, where tradition seemed protected behind familiar walls, change quietly entered through the front gate. The first signs were almost invisible. A different style of clothing appeared on a visiting merchant. Someone carried a pocket watch imported from Europe. A government official spoke about new commercial regulations. Young men discussed studying English. Visitors who once debated poetry now argued about railroads and international trade. The conversations had changed. So had the country. Eiko noticed another difference. Fewer samurai came to Yoshiwara. For centuries, they had occupied the highest social class. They carried 2 swords, received hereditary stipends, represented authority wherever they traveled. Now many struggled financially. Government reforms gradually reduced their privileges. Some found work as teachers. Others became businessmen. Some simply disappeared into ordinary life. One evening, an aging samurai visited the establishment where Hana worked. His kimono was carefully repaired. His swords remained polished, but his eyes revealed quiet exhaustion. He asked only for tea. No music. No entertainment. Only tea. Hana served him personally. After several minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "When I was young," he said, "people bowed when they saw my family." He smiled sadly. "Yesterday my grandson asked me how to apply for work at a factory." Hana poured another cup. "Does that make you angry?" The old samurai stared into the rising steam. "No." He paused. "It makes me realize history never asks permission." Outside the district, the transformation accelerated. In 1872, Japan opened its first railway between Tokyo and Yokohama. Crowds gathered simply to watch the locomotive. Some had never imagined a machine powerful enough to move without horses. Others feared it. Children chased the trains whenever they passed. Newspapers described them with excitement. Within a generation, railways would connect cities that once required weeks of travel. Distance itself was beginning to shrink. Eiko had never ridden a train. She had never even seen one. Yet she listened eagerly whenever travelers described the strange iron machines. "They breathe smoke," one merchant explained. "They scream louder than thunder. They move faster than a horse can gallop. Another visitor laughed. In 20 years, people will wonder how we ever lived without them. Not everyone welcomed change. Many older residents of Yoshiwara feared modernization would destroy the traditions they had spent entire lives preserving. Music instructors worried young people preferred Western instruments. Calligraphy teachers complained students no longer practiced enough. Kimono makers noticed increasing interest in foreign fabrics. Even hairstyles slowly evolved. Every generation believed something precious was disappearing. Every generation was partly correct. One rainy afternoon, Hana and Eiko walked through a quiet courtyard where cherry trees had long since lost their blossoms. They found Chiyo sitting beneath the wooden veranda. The elderly woman looked weaker than before. Age had finally begun to slow her steady hands. "I heard a train yesterday," Chiyo said. "I've never seen one." Eiko smiled. "Neither have I." Chiyo looked toward the gray sky. "When I first came here, people traveled for days just to reach Edo." She laughed softly. "Now the whole country seems determined to arrive at tomorrow as quickly as possible." Hana sat beside her. "Do you think that's good?" Chiyo considered the question carefully. "I think every generation believes it is standing between two worlds." She closed her eyes for a moment. The old one behind them. The new one ahead. And no one realizes they're building history while simply trying to survive. That evening, Yoshiwara glowed beneath hundreds of lanterns exactly as it had decades earlier. Music floated through the streets. Guests admired elegant silk robes. Artists filled sketchbooks with graceful figures. At first glance, nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Electricity would eventually replace many lanterns. Photographs would begin replacing painted portraits. New laws would reshape licensed entertainment districts. Western visitors would arrive in increasing numbers. Tokyo itself, no longer officially called Edo, would continue expanding into one of the world's great modern capitals. Yoshiwara would remain famous, but it would never again exist in the same world that had created it. Standing beneath the entrance gate one quiet evening, Eiko looked toward the growing city beyond the walls. When she had arrived years earlier, those walls had seemed impossibly high. Now they looked strangely small. Not because they had changed, but because the world outside had become so much larger. And soon, another force even more powerful than politics or technology would arrive. A new generation born with no memory of the old Tokugawa world. They would ask difficult questions. About freedom. About equality. About women's lives. And those questions would echo through Yoshiwara in ways no one could yet imagine. By the 1880s, Tokyo no longer resembled the city Eiko had first entered as a frightened 14-year-old girl. The name Edo had disappeared from official maps. Wide new roads cut through neighborhoods that had once been little more than winding lanes. Brick buildings stood beside traditional wooden houses. Telegraph poles stretched across the skyline. Steam whistles echoed from railway stations. Newspapers arrived every morning carrying stories not only from Tokyo, but from Europe, America, China, and beyond. Japan had stepped onto the world stage. The transformation amazed foreign visitors. Many described Tokyo as a city living in 2 centuries at once. A man wearing a Western-style suit might pass a Buddhist monk in traditional robes. A steam locomotive could race past farmers carrying rice by hand. Gas lamps illuminated streets where rickshaws still rolled over ancient stone roads. Old Japan and modern Japan walked side by side. Yoshiwara survived within this changing city like an island, surrounded by an ever-rising tide. Its famous gates still welcomed visitors. Its lanterns still glowed every evening. Music still floated through its streets. But the people inside sensed that the world beyond the walls no longer looked at the district in quite the same way. One afternoon, Eiko noticed several young women carrying schoolbooks as they walked past the district. She watched them disappear into the distance. Years earlier, such a sight would have been unusual. The Meiji government had begun expanding public education, believing that a modern nation required educated citizens. Schools slowly became more common. Literacy increased. Books became cheaper. New ideas traveled faster than ever before. Education could not erase poverty, but it offered possibilities that earlier generations had never known. Eiko quietly whispered to herself, "If I had been born 20 years later." She never finished the sentence. She did not need to. Hana understood. Inside one of the tea houses, an unusual discussion unfolded between several regular guests. One was a newspaper editor. Another taught at a newly established university. The third worked as a government official. Their conversation sounded very different from those Eiko remembered years before. "We cannot become a modern nation," the editor argued, "without discussing the lives of women." The professor nodded. "Education is changing expectations." The government official remained thoughtful. "Change must come carefully." "Carefully," the editor replied. "History never changes carefully." Their debate continued long into the evening. Eiko carried tea into the room several times. Each visit revealed another unfamiliar word. Rights, citizenship, reform, opportunity, progress. These ideas rarely appeared in conversations inside Yoshiwara before the Meiji era. Now they seemed impossible to avoid. Not everyone welcomed these discussions. Some believed Yoshiwara represented an important cultural tradition. Others viewed it as a symbol of inequality that no modern nation should preserve unchanged. Newspapers occasionally published articles criticizing the conditions faced by women working under debt contracts. Religious organizations began supporting shelters for vulnerable women. Charitable groups quietly offered assistance to those seeking new lives. Real change remained slow, but public opinion had begun to shift. Questions once spoken only in whispers now appeared in print. One evening, Hana found Eiko sitting beneath the same cherry tree where they had shared their first conversation years earlier. "You've been thinking." "I have." "About what?" Eiko looked toward the entrance gate. "When I arrived here, I thought these walls kept us from the world." She smiled gently. "Now I think they've kept the world from seeing us." Hana sat beside her. "The world is beginning to look. Do you think it will understand?" Hana considered the question. "Perhaps not completely. But understanding usually begins with looking." A few weeks later, a young journalist visited Yoshiwara with permission to write about its history. Unlike earlier writers who focused almost entirely on glamour and famous courtesans, he spent hours interviewing cooks, cleaners, musicians, carpenters, gardeners, and elderly workers. He filled notebook after notebook. One afternoon he approached Chiyo. "I've read about famous Warren," he said politely. "I'd like to hear about everyone else." Chiyo laughed. "No one has ever asked me that before. I think history should." For several hours, she described ordinary mornings. Long winters. Festival preparations. Fires. Floods. Friendships. Loss. Hope. The journalist barely interrupted. When he finally closed his notebook, he bowed deeply. "Thank you. For what? For reminding me that history isn't only made by extraordinary people. As he walked away, Chiyo quietly watched him disappear through the gate. Maybe, she whispered, someone will remember. That autumn, Eiko stood outside the entrance just before sunset. Hundreds of lanterns slowly flickered to life. The familiar glow spread across the streets exactly as it had on the rainy evening when she first arrived. She remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling that her future had ended the moment the gate closed behind her. She had been wrong. Life had not ended. It had simply become more complicated than she could have imagined. She had witnessed the end of one political era, the birth of another, the arrival of steamships, railways, newspapers, modern schools, new ideas about society. And throughout every change, one truth remained constant. History was never only about emperors, governments, or wars. It was also about ordinary people who woke each morning, did their work, cared for one another, and quietly endured whatever the next day demanded. Those were the lives most easily forgotten. Yet they were also the lives that held history together. Far beyond Tokyo, the 20th century was approaching. It would bring earthquakes, war, modernization on an unprecedented scale, and challenges no one inside Yoshiwara could yet imagine. The district had survived for centuries. Its greatest test still lay ahead. The 20th century arrived without fanfare. No bells announced it. No great ceremony marked its beginning inside Yoshiwara. The lanterns were lit as they had always been. The tea houses welcomed their evening guests. Musicians tuned their shamisen. Servants swept the streets before dawn. Life continued. Yet beyond the district, Japan was changing faster than at any other time in its history. Factories multiplied across the country. Steel mills replaced small workshops. Electric lights gradually illuminated city streets. Streetcars carried thousands of passengers every day. Photographs became increasingly common, preserving faces that earlier generations could only paint. Tokyo had become one of Asia's fastest-growing capitals. Foreign diplomats, engineers, journalists, and businessmen now walked streets that had once been closed to almost everyone from outside Japan. The nation that had isolated itself for centuries had become an emerging modern power. Inside Yoshiwara, however, tradition still defined daily life. Many buildings remained wooden. Paper lanterns continued to glow each evening. Kimono remained the standard dress for most workers. Visitors still admired performances rooted in customs hundreds of years old. It was as though time flowed at two different speeds. One outside the walls, one within them. Eiko had grown older. The frightened village girl who had entered the district decades earlier had become one of its most respected senior attendants. New arrivals now looked to her for guidance, just as she had once looked to Hana. Her hair carried threads of silver. Fine lines marked the corners of her eyes. But her voice remained calm, patient, steady. One rainy afternoon, a 16-year-old newcomer named Emi sat alone in tears. She reminded Eiko painfully of herself. Without speaking, Eiko quietly placed a warm cup of tea beside her. "I don't belong here," Emi whispered. Eiko nodded. "I said those exact words many years ago." "What happened?" "I survived." Emi looked at her with uncertain hope. "Does it get easier?" Eiko thought carefully before answering. "No." She offered a gentle smile. "But people become stronger than they imagined." Hana had changed as well. Years of discipline had earned her enormous respect throughout the district. Younger apprentices admired her elegance. Visitors praised her conversation. Yet she accepted compliments with increasing distance. Fame no longer interested her. She had learned how quickly admiration faded. One evening, she and Eiko walked through the nearly empty streets after a spring festival. The lanterns swayed gently in the night breeze. "It feels quieter than before," Eiko observed. Hana nodded. "The city has more places for entertainment now." Tokyo had expanded dramatically. Modern theaters, concert halls, restaurants, hotels, Western-style cafes, department stores. The city's cultural life no longer revolved around Yoshiwara alone. Competition had arrived. The district remained famous, but it no longer stood alone at the center of urban culture. Meanwhile, reformers across Japan continued debating the future of licensed prostitution. Some argued regulation protected public health and reduced crime. Others insisted the system trapped vulnerable women in cycles of poverty and debt. Newspapers published editorials from both sides. Women's organizations increasingly demanded legal reforms. Christian missionaries established rescue homes. Social activists investigated working conditions. The discussion had entered the national conversation. Questions that once seemed unthinkable were now openly debated. Could a modern nation continue traditions created centuries earlier? Could economic necessity ever justify the loss of personal freedom? Who benefited most from the existing system? No easy answers emerged. But the questions themselves represented profound change. One autumn afternoon, a foreign journalist visited Yoshiwara. Unlike earlier travelers fascinated only by its exotic reputation, she carried a small camera and several notebooks. She interviewed shopkeepers, gardeners, musicians, attendants, doctors. She asked about education, health, family, work, daily routines. When she reached Eiko, she paused. "What do you wish people outside Japan understood about this place?" The question surprised her. For several moments she remained silent. Finally she answered, "They think this district is only about beauty." She looked around the quiet courtyard. But beauty is the smallest part of its story. The journalist slowly lowered her pencil. "What is the largest part?" Eiko looked toward dozens of workers preparing for another evening. People carrying water, cooking meals, repairing lanterns, practicing music, sweeping wooden floors. "People," she said quietly. "Just people." Months later, the article appeared in an overseas magazine. It described Yoshiwara not as a fantasy, but as a complicated community shaped by history, economics, tradition, and human resilience. For perhaps the first time, many foreign readers encountered a portrayal that looked beyond stereotypes. Not everyone agreed with the author's conclusions. Some criticized them. Others praised them. But one thing had changed. The conversation had become more honest. On a cool evening, Hana climbed once again to the rooftop where she and Eiko had stood many years before. Tokyo stretched farther than either had imagined possible. Electric lights sparkled across neighborhoods that had once been open fields. Factory smokestacks rose in the distance. Train whistles echoed through the night. "This city doesn't stop growing," Eiko said. Hana smiled. "Neither does history." For several minutes they watched silently. Then Eiko asked a question neither had spoken aloud before. "When we're gone." Hana turned toward her. "Do you think anyone will remember us?" Hana looked over the endless city. "Maybe not our names." She smiled gently. "But perhaps they'll remember that people like us lived here." She paused. And sometimes, that is enough. Far below them, another generation of frightened young women crossed the entrance gate, carrying small bundles exactly as Eiko once had decades earlier. The faces had changed. The century had changed. Japan had changed. But some stories still repeated themselves. Not because history refused to move forward, but because changing laws was often easier than changing the realities of poverty, inequality, and human survival. And before another quarter century had passed, nature itself would deliver a catastrophe so immense that it would erase much of old Tokyo in a single day, and Yoshiwara would once again stand in the path of history,